Please help me welcome Chelsea. While we get her mic'd, if it's okay, I have this quote from Stan Groff, The Way of the Psychonaut, and I just wanted to say this is a way for us to build the bridge here. This is from the preface. It is a good time to reflect on what LSD has brought to the world and how it changed the understanding of consciousness and the human psyche. No other substance has ever brought such great promise in so many different disciplines. However, drastic irrational legislation ended what was considered the golden era of psychopharmacology and turned Albert's wonder child into a problem child. After several decades during which legal research into psychedelics was virtually impossible, we are now experiencing an unexpected global renaissance of interest in these fascinating substances. It is becoming increasingly clear that LSD was a wonder child, but it was born into a dysfunctional family.
Well done.
Thanks, Christina.
Well done.
Wonderful. Hi, everybody.
All right.
Hi, the whole weekend. I'm happy to be here and join you all. Like Christina said, my name's Chelsea Rose, and I've been working with the Zendo Project for just over a decade. My first year working with the Zendo Project was in 2013, after being a guest in the Zendo in 2012. So very passionate about this work that we're up to at Zendo. And I just wanted to see how many of you here are familiar with the Zendo Project. Wonderful, great. Okay, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Zendo Project, we provide psychedelic peer support at large events and gatherings, and we also provide education and training into how to sit with people in altered states, as well as working with policy and advocacy around removing barriers and making harm reduction more available. So that's the work that we're up to at the Zendo Project. And Annie asked me to give a little update on what we've been up to. So the Zendo Project was founded at Burning Man in 2012, and we were a project of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And so just this last year, we separated out of MAPS and became our own nonprofit. So it's a really exciting new time for us. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about what we're doing. We just got our 501c3 status in May, which is really exciting. And it really gives us the opportunity to really focus on our own mission and vision, which is really to see peer support services widely accessible at large events and gatherings around the country, and also just to spread this wonderful knowledge of how we can take care of one another while in an altered state, and especially when that experience becomes difficult. So, so I'll just start with sharing a little bit about what we do at events. So we go out to events. We have a pretty large volunteer base. We're just at Burning Man for 20 days. We had 500 volunteers on the playa out there with us, and about 44 people per shift. We have 2 Zendos out there, 2 locations, and we run 24/7, and we train those volunteers, about an 8-hour training to volunteer at Burning Man with us. And and so we're out there for a week, basically available to the community. This was our 9th year at Burning Man. It would have been our 11th, but because of COVID, we weren't out there for 2 years. And over the years, we've provided care to hundreds of participants in Black Rock City. And it's really been so beautiful to see how it's evolved over the years. From in the early years, we couldn't even use the word psychedelic in our literature, to now really, Black Rock City and Burning Man is very much behind Zendo. Many people are very familiar with what we do out there. So, that's how a little bit of the trajectory of how that's changed over time. And then this next year, we're really looking to expand to more events. So we have in the past done several events on 4 different continents, but then during COVID, things really shut down. So we're really coming back to life and hoping to be at more events this coming year. Events are really where, it's really where we get to learn what it is that we're doing, where we get to improve our model, and it gives hundreds of volunteers an opportunity to sit with people in altered states, which really isn't very accessible at this point. So it's a fabulous opportunity in that regard, and really why events feel so important and really the heart of the work that we're doing. And then our education program is the second piece of what we're really working on. And so for our education, there's several different pieces of the education component. So there's the education we offer our volunteers, and then we're really working on our developing a training program that's available to the public. So right now we're working on having monthly trainings regularly available to the public. And then additionally, we're working on educating other harm reduction organizations on how to go out and provide psychedelic peer support at large events and gatherings, or even in their community at smaller events. Annie knows lots about this. The Take 3 community, they have a really amazing service there that they do, similar to Zendo in providing peer support. And there's also opportunity to train employees who work at places where their patrons may choose to explore altered states. For example, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Meow Wolf, but it's a real interactive, immersive museum space, and that's a place where we've had the opportunity to train their staff on how to work with people who might come into that space in an altered state and then end up needing some support. And then the third piece that we're really working on in this new phase is policy and advocacy. And like I said, removing barriers to harm reduction and creating standards of care for harm reduction, and also working on many of the complicated pieces, like where these services fit into the first responder dynamics that go on at events with medical and security, and also working on securing insurance for our organization. So that's been a journey we've been on for many years, but that's really those three pieces, the events and the education and the policy and advocacy, is really where most of our energy is going at this point. Really excitingly, for an example of something we got to do in the policy and advocacy department, is we got to go out and spend 3.5 days with SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the federal government. They invited us there to consult with them on harm reduction for psychedelics, and it was the first government meeting that has ever occurred on psychedelics where they intentionally called professionals in to teach the government about what's happening in psychedelic harm reduction. So super exciting, and that's a relationship that's continuing to develop, so looking forward to seeing where that goes as well. And so I'm just going to go ahead and share with you all a little bit about the Zendo principles. So Zendo has 4 pillars or 4 principles of psychedelic peer support, and these are the skill sets and the mentality that we bring into a sitting experience as a sitter sitting with someone who's needing support. And I will just say that what I love about the Zendo principles and the skill set that we teach is, while it's intended and developed and born out of sitting with people in altered states, it really is just an incredible life skill set for what it means to be a good friend and what it means to really help anybody who's in need of support. And so I just always remind people to keep that in mind, that these skill sets are really widely applicable. And even at Burning Man last year, about 60% of the people who came in seeking support, we had about 600 guests come in last year, and about 60% of them came in seeking support related to an altered state or a psychedelic experience, and about 40% just came in because they needed support. So, and it not related to a substance. So, we're providing kind of a crisis response that has a specialty in psychedelic experiences and altered states. So our first principle is safe space. And safe space is just what it sounds like, and we all know what the quality of safety means. It might be different for anybody, so we kind of say tending to safety, as opposed to safety being a static state. So that might mean something different to every individual person. But essentially, we're creating a container where people can come in, and we're looking out for their well-being while listening to what that might mean to every individual person. And safety, I think of it as just a foundational human need, that we really need that to really go deeper or go further into our experience. And so that's just the foundational beginning piece of the Zendo principles. The second Zendo principle is sitting, not guiding. And sitting, not guiding It's really my favorite principle because it's so simple in so many ways. The idea of sitting, not guiding, is really just about being with somebody, just being a presence, being there with them, allowing their experience to unfold, allowing their inner guidance to arise and guide the experience. And, you know, as a Western culture, I feel like we're so oriented toward fixing and doing. And so it definitely can be a practice to cultivate what it means to be, but I think it's such a wonderful practice for all of us. You know, how do we show up in a difficult moment and just allow that moment to be happening without trying to fix what's occurring or change what's happening? And, you know, it can be very hard to see someone going through something difficult and not want to fix it. But there can be really wisdom and gems and a deep understanding that comes through those experiences. So I love the principle of sitting, not guiding, and you know, again, it's just a very much about presence and being. And the third principle is similar in many ways, and that's talk through, not down. And so, you know, often when you tell someone, oh, I go out to events and I work with people who are having difficult psychedelic experiences, the first thing people say is, oh, and you talk them down. And really, we don't talk them down. We think of it as going through something, getting to the other side of it, that the only way is through, which is really true of so many of the challenging things that happen in our lives, is that, yeah, absolutely, in that moment, we may want things to end, but with a little support and guidance, we can also find the courage to turn toward the experience and see what that experience has to offer us. And the fourth principle is difficult. Sorry, I got distracted. Difficult is not necessarily bad. And that principle is about the idea that challenging experiences in our lives can really be opportunities for growth and change. And so rather than trying to, again, move away from the difficulty, we can cultivate a capacity to turn toward the difficult experience and see what that moment has to offer us. And so that's the fourth principle in the Zendo. And, you know, one thing that I find myself sharing a lot lately is that, you know, I couldn't personally imagine who I might be if psychedelics had never come into my life. But the truth is that psychedelics scare me. You know, there's an aspect of them, there is this unknown piece when we approach psychedelics where we just don't know where it's going to take us or what's going to happen. And I think it can, you know, it can take quite a bit of courage to even go down that path of choosing to do that. But there's just something inside of us that wants to understand our human experience more deeply and wants to, you know, explore our inner world and our outer world. And I really feel that there's this beautiful piece that can happen when we have support to turn toward and find the courage to go into an unknown or potentially scary place inside of ourselves and have support to see what we find and what we discover. And you know, a lot of the traumas that occur in our lives often happen because we don't have support and because we're going through something and we're alone. And so to have the experience of going through something difficult, like what might occur on a psychedelic, and then have somebody be there for you, that can be so profound, and that can reach so many deep levels inside of ourselves, especially because we say psychedelics they amplify, right? They're non-specific amplifiers. They're going to amplify whatever's happening to us. And so if, you know, they may amplify something difficult happening, but they would also amplify potentially something wonderful happening, like having support in a moment when you really need it. So that's a piece I really love about peer support. Is it's the idea that it's really in the words themselves. Peer support, you know, it's a human to human, being there for one another, learning how to support one another. And peer support is really, the skill sets are very accessible, right? Psychedelic therapy is definitely not yet accessible. And even regular therapy really isn't accessible to everybody who might be seeking it or need it. But our friends are just a phone call away, or, you know, and so if folks have that skill set, or if folks understand that, you know, some of the really simple pieces of being there for one another in those spaces, then that's accessible, that's scalable. And so one of the missions of Zendo is really to, have these skill sets be so widely available and widely known. And ultimately, in a pie in the sky sort of world, I hope that these sort of services and these sort of trainings would be widely available at all large events and gatherings, because people, 95% of psychedelic use happens in recreational settings. So that's pretty substantial. And so for communities who know that folks are using psychedelics or mind-altering substances, to know that here's some basic skill sets that can provide me tools to both help myself in one of those spaces, but also to help one another, that is incredibly scalable, incredibly accessible, and one way that we can really build in support to this community as it grows and changes and gains all the momentum that it's currently gaining. So, so maybe I'll just pause there and see if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Are there Bay Area events that the Zendo people can volunteer at?
Are there Bay Area events? So that's a great question. We have. Do you need me to pause? Yes,
I want to picture my.
Go ahead. Yeah, it's kind of getting pulled by my hair. 1 second and I'll answer, but I can hear myself more now. Let me pull my hair off to this side.
Wow.
I know it's a lot of hair.
It's a lot of difference. There we go.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's better. Okay. I think you can probably all hear me just because it's a small room. Thanks.
Hello.
So we have. Oh,
The question has to do
Yeah, that's what I did.
I can repeat it. Yeah.
Okay.
The question was, are there Bay Area events where people can have the opportunity to volunteer? So we have done Bay Area events in the past. Bicycle Day just immediately comes to mind. But we haven't in quite a while, and we're really hoping to be able to start doing more one day or just a few day events in the Bay Area. So if you know events that might be interested in having our service, please let them know about us, and hopefully we'll be able to be at more Bay Area events. We're also hoping to do some live trainings, definitely in next year in the Bay Area. Yeah.
I was interested in what ways.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the point that you made about the majority of uses in recreational settings, that we need to kind of accept that as a really valid place for healing also.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, in the model you talked about 4 principles, and that your ways of practice and model have evolved over the course of time since 2012, and I was just wondering what stands out to you. What have been some of the newer insights or adjustments to your approach?
Yeah, thank you. I'll have to think about it for a moment. I mean, personally, I think that the practice of peer support, actually having the experience and getting in there and sitting with people, I mean, once you have those skill sets, you find that you bring them to your life in many places, and then that itself teaches you what works and what doesn't work. So, I mean, for example, I would say I bring some of those principles, or all of those principles really, to parenting my kids, right? And in doing that, I've learned, certain things that work, certain things that don't work. And as a therapist, you learn a lot of reflective skills, and acknowledgement skills. But sometimes I've learned, for example, that doesn't really work with my kids, or one of them in particular. If he's having a difficult time, he just wants me to be quiet. He doesn't want me to try and ask him more about it. He doesn't want me to try and come up with a solution. And so that's been really helpful to me, to just learn for myself that in that place I can even just be quiet. And, as a therapist, I think that's a good skill to cultivate, but it's really a good skill for all of us to cultivate. And also I think the other piece that stands out to me, which is related to that, is just really slowing down and reading what's happening in that moment, and just learning how different it is with everybody. Because there may be instances where I might give a recommendation to someone or encourage a particular behavior or option, and then in another case it's very clear that's not what I'm going to do. And so you know, again, it's that piece of showing up in the present moment and really just paying attention and slowing down and seeing what's happening. And there isn't a one size fits all. And I think that's what I like about the principles is they're broad, right? They're kind of like, they can hold quite a lot of different experiences. But the main piece that I think ties them all together is that in the moment, that's where all the information is of what's the best way to navigate, and we can get in our own way with that. And so just paying attention to that and paying attention to ourselves has been a part of cultivating my own experience of learning to use those principles, both in the Zendo and also just in my life. Yeah, Annie.
I understand that you have specific support services for Zendo volunteers and staff as well to support them in this work. Could you tell us a little bit about those services and how they've evolved over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing that up. Yeah, so one thing we've learned over time is that, you know, we'll go out to an event and when we're running the Zendo, quite a bit of intensity can go on in there. And so therefore what we've seen is that intensity can really have an impact on the sitters themselves and the volunteers. And so we started to really ask ourselves, how do we not only provide support to the attendees or the community that we're serving, but how do we also attend to the support and care of the people who are doing the caring themselves? So we call it the sitting for the sitters or support for the supporters. And so this year we developed an initiative, it's called the Pulse Team. And the Pulse Team is basically a team that comes in and their responsibility is to look out for the wellness of our volunteers. And at most events, festivals like Lightning in a Bottle, for example, we have maybe 100, 120 volunteers. Burning Man was quite a bit more at around 500. So this team was our first year piloting. It was at Burning Man this year, and they were so busy. They had so many people coming in who would have an experience sitting with somebody in the Zendo and then want or need support with what came up for them in that experience. So it feels like building in additional important layers of support. They also are supporting with feedback from volunteers in the community so that we can continue to learn what is it the community is experiencing when they're sitting for the Zendo, and how can we use that feedback to continue to improve our services. And then they're also really supporting us with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that relates to providing quality care in the Zendo. So what we've been looking at there is not only just to diversify our volunteer base and make sure that identities of all different types feel welcome in the Zendo when they approach the Zendo, for folks to really know that there's representation in our volunteer group, but also that just having a diverse volunteer group doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to provide culturally competent care. And so we've really been digging into our training and adding components to our training and going through our training and really learning how we can make our training more culturally more oriented toward culturally attuned care. And so that team has been really helping with that. So they've been helping with many aspects of how do we really ensure that the Zendo is a safe place for volunteers themselves and a safe place for people of all identities to come and get the support that they need. Does that answer your question, Annie?
Yes, thank you.
Great, yeah.
Hi, I just want to say it's so inspiring to hear that you guys spun off from MAPS and you're this kind of and in this innovative moment doing this work to care for the caregivers. I think that's so needed on the system on the whole, and I think that's been a big theme. I'm curious to hear more about the other kinds of innovations that are happening in your programs and like how what kind of scale, I guess, ambitions you guys have.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it kind of feels like a little bit of a tipping point because we've spent so much of the last year really getting ourselves just set up as an organization, which is heavily administrative. And then we went right into psychedelic science. We provided supported psychedelic science. We had about 70 guests in the Zendo over the 3 days that we were there. So that was pretty incredible. And then we just launched right into Burning Man. So we're really at this phase over the next 3 months where we're like, okay, let's think about our strategy and the next steps in regard to that. And so it's been an exciting brainstorming phase. I'm trying to think what comes to mind. I mean, like I said, if I could imagine really how peer support could grow in the world, it would be, you know, when you go out to an event and you have a certain size event, medical is required, right? You need a certain level of security. But if you, you know, what we're missing out of that first responder triangle is the mental health component. And so, you know, and there's a piece that serves that the first responders aren't equipped to set up or aren't equipped to deal with. And so in the long run, I would love to see that at large events of certain sizes that it's required that they not only have medical and security, but that they also have a crisis response team and hopefully crisis response teams that are trained to deal with folks who are choosing to explore psychedelics. So I think in that sense, there's this kind of big view of how can we grow toward that. There are some challenges with scalability when it comes to providing peer support, right? An enormous amount of the effort that we have 3 staff at the Zendo. We've got Perception and Jessa here. And, you know, we, on that scale, even Burning Man takes up the majority of our year, even though that's 1 week. So when we think about getting out to several large events a year, you know, the challenge is really the manpower, person power to get us out there and to be able to accomplish that. So I think scalability, one innovation I feel really excited about is how do we train other groups to do this, and how do we help those other groups overcome some of the limitations of being a small organization, right? Zendo has the benefit of have been around a decade. Folks are familiar with us. We have support. We can afford insurance. But a small, you know, harm reduction organization might not have that ability, and so one of the pieces that I'm really passionate about understanding is how do we scale this? How do we teach other groups how to do this, and how to both protect themselves and then be able to go out and serve their communities? And it's definitely not super clear at this point, but hopefully as we continue to work through these pieces, that path will become more clear, and more folks will be able to provide these services, because there's so many events happening where this could be useful and where it's not available. So that's one of the first things that comes to mind. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on it. Oh, I have one. One comes to mind is that we've just developed a digital paperwork system, which is just, I mean, one piece is really important because it helps us to easily understand the statistics of who's coming in and why they're coming in. We don't collect names, everything's confidential, but you know, we know, did they come in because they were on a substance or needed support related to an experience, or did they come in, you know, because they broke up with a partner and they're just, you know, having a tough time and need some additional support. So so gathering that information is really helpful. I think as we gather that data, we can really use that to push the mission forward. And it also, you know, having good paperwork helps also with liability and all of those fun things, which is definitely a piece that we're up against when we're providing this kind of novel new service that we believe in and see as really needed. And I think the community really sees it's needed, but there isn't a standard in place. And so developing those standards and understanding scalability and then being able to share what we've learned with other organizations so that they can do the same. Yeah, those are a few things. I don't know if anything else comes to mind for either of you two. Yeah. Wonderful.
Do you want to introduce your team that's here?
Sure, I would love to. In the front we have Perception. Perception is helping us with really everything internal and has been incredible with volunteer coordination, and the systems that she's developed to be able to schedule 500 volunteers is quite incredible, and just keeping us organized. And Jessa came on staff in May, and she's been working with Zendo for about 5 or 6 years. And she is helping with education and developing the education and our marketing, and you know, we're all a little bit of jack of all trades at this point, you know, just helping to move this forward. So yeah, happy to have both of them here with us.
And I'd just like to point out that these are women leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, Zendo's been so incredible, and in that way, Lene Ponte was our first director at MAPS, and Sarah Gale, and then myself, and so it's been just such a joy to work in such a matriarchal team and really see the community that's grown out of what we're doing. I mean, I just stand back and I'm really in awe because even, Burning Man, I'm sure many of you heard it rained out there this year, and it was just so beautiful and inspiring to watch the way people come together and take care of each other. And, that's what we go out there to do, but then just really seeing us put those peer support skills, like those values that we carry into the Zendo, into action all around us was so beautiful. So, yeah, thank you for that, Christina.
Thank you. As you know, I buy the insurance policies for the Take 3 community, and that's been quite a journey. Could you talk a little bit about getting insurance for the Zendo as a freestanding 501c3, and what some of the challenges have been in doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we really struggled and actually couldn't get insurance for many years when we were at MAPS. As many of you may know, there was a lawsuit in 2017, lightning in a bottle, after a guest who came into the Zendo was transported to medical and she didn't survive, and so there was a wrongful death lawsuit. That actually just concluded this year, so we're able to speak about it. But at MAPS, it really prevented us from being able to get insurance, and so that was a major barrier for us, and a really tragic event. And so now that we're our own organization, and that incident is, no longer with us as an organization, standing alone organization. Of course, it has carried with us in so many ways. We were able to work with brokers and legal counsel to get insurance this last year. So that's a major change for us. But it's very expensive insurance. So that's where I say earlier that it's a barrier to small organizations being able to do this work with insurance. Maybe on the scale that we do it, it's much more expensive, but something that we're really taking a look at understanding more with the support of our insurance brokers and our legal counsel.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that MAPS, when it ran the Zendo project, didn't have insurance prior to the lawsuit.
Yeah.
The lawsuit was not the reason that you couldn't get insurance. It
Yeah.
was, my understanding is that it was discomfort with the very concept of providing psychedelic peer
Yeah.
support.
Yeah.
And do you see an easing of that in the marketplace for insurance, and could that impact other groups?
Yeah. I'm not as familiar with how the insurance efforts were when Zendo was still at MAPS, other than to know that they weren't able to get it. But I do know that we had an amazing insurance company that we worked with. They came to Psychedelic Science and are very invested in the work that we're doing. And I know that as a result of that, they've really gone out in an effort to try and find what's available. And so, from that view, I see it changing more and more, and hopefully that will continue to be the case. Yeah.
Which insurance company insures the Zendo?
It's called Prime. Yeah, Prime Insurance. And the woman who we worked with at Prime Insurance, her boyfriend is a burner, so she was also very excited. So perhaps it is that, people are understanding these communities more and more and really seeing the need. And but I definitely felt, as soon as I entered into the insurance process, as we were separating from MAPS, I really felt the support of, the brokers and our legal counsel in making it possible. So I think that it's headed in that direction. At least I certainly hope so.
Just to clarify, is this insurance per event or based on the number of people?
It's just insurance all year long, so it's by the year. And you can do it by event, and that I'm less familiar with. I think Annie probably understands more how it works per event.
Okay. And how do you calculate the number of people per event? Do you talk to the organizers in case of Burning Man it's pretty big
Yeah.
and you have some like
Yeah.
prior knowledge?
Mhm.
Or is that something you do based on the people who are supposed to attend the festival?
Yeah, we usually, the amount of volunteers we have is based on the population of the festival. So, and it just depends. I mean, with Burning Man, it's such a massive event, and at Burning Man, volunteers are responsible for getting their own tickets. But then they're only required to work 2 shifts, whereas at a festival where we exchange tickets with the event, then, folks have to do more shifts, and they get a ticket as a result of that, but then, they have more shifts, so it's less volunteers at some of the smaller festival events.
Yeah, I could just very briefly talk about insurance. It's one of my favorite topics.
In the Take 3 community, we have an event insurance policy, as Chelsea Rose just said. It's a $2 million policy. And then liability insurance for the company itself, another $2 million policy. And then we as owners of the company also have umbrella insurance policies for ourselves, so ranging between $2 and $3 million. So a total of, in my case, $7 million worth of insurance. And the secret sauce is that if you don't serve or sell alcohol, your insurance is much less expensive than if you do, because the statistics are very clear. Which drug is, most dangerous, and the impact that has on emergency room visits and so on. So it's one thing we've learned over the years.
Yeah. And I would imagine that per event is more accessible, than insuring for an entire year. Oh, right here behind you, Jessa. Yeah.
I had a question, reminded by the earlier question about care for the volunteers. What type of energetic and spiritual hygiene practices are taught or practiced most effectively in these settings?
Yeah, I mean, just based on not really knowing what folks' spiritual beliefs are, we really encouraged, and I imagine you're talking about the sitters, the volunteers that we're training. Yeah, okay, yeah. So we definitely have a large section in our training about self-care and the importance of self-care, and knowing that self-care is specific to every individual. So we really encourage that, and so that could look a lot of different ways. I mean, sometimes we do sit there and we talk about what are the different things that we might be able to do, whether that is something simple like sometimes after a sit, someone will wash their hands, or some of those, basics care practices of how do you integrate the experience as a sitter, and then, take care of yourself in that way. We don't have any specific suggestions that we give folks around spiritual hygiene. Just so much as to really just say, like, we recognize the impact this can have on you personally, so how can you self-care? And then we also provide integration services for our sitters. So, after Burning Man this year, I would say we've had, 10 integration circles so far? So folks can come, they can keep coming, they can talk about what they experienced, and I think that really probably provides the most integrative and self-care oriented experiences, just to be able to have a space where you can come and talk about what happened and maybe what you might personally need to do to take care of yourself after being a sitter. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, I think we're doing good. We still have a little over 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I'm in the field of public health, so the harm reduction model makes a lot of sense, and really not only a legitimate need, but a good entry point. The language is already established and accepted. And there's a little bit of a missed opportunity. It kind of relates to your 4th principle around not just because something's difficult doesn't mean it's bad.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you foresee a future where you have, if it's a flip side of the same coin, or you move away from harm reduction language altogether and are looking at like the growth opportunity within that care tent and that type of thing, and just wondering what your imaginings are in that direction.
Yeah, let me just make sure I understand your question. So, so like you're kind of referring to harm reduction itself as a field of mental health, and how, like how, are you thinking about how we speak about it, like how we say harm reduction?
Well, harm reduction is reducing something bad.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's amplifying something good.
Right,
and,
right.
And seeing that, and that's kind of the psychedelic framework, and it's
Yeah.
captured a little bit in your fourth principle
Yeah.
around that. And
Yeah.
you know, like if you're working with certain plant medicines, they're, you know, vomiting is called a side effect, when to other people they'd be like, that's the
Yeah,
healing.
or
you
getting
know,
well,
so,
getting well, yeah.
So
Mhm.
we're in
Yeah.
that harm reduction, there's kind of a
Yeah,
box that you're in
yeah,
that maybe limits what could, you know, a bigger idea of what's happening in that tent. And
Yeah.
I just was curious if you foresee a time, and I'm not meaning to say there's anything inadequate with
Yeah.
what's happening, I'm just curious if in your wildest musings, if you start thinking about it in other ways as well, or
Yeah.
do you see this really is the right
Yeah.
framework to practice?
yeah, it's a great question. You know, I feel like it comes up often how we use the phrase harm reduction, and words are powerful, and here you have this word harm. And so I think when I think about using that phrase, I'm also a clinician, so I recognize that, you know, within the mainstream mental health framework, that people know what that is, right? People know what it is, and it speaks to that piece of their harms can come from these things. Like I said, psychedelics make me nervous, scare me. You know, so there is that piece where we recognize that harm is possible, or, you know, dangerous situations are possible. So I think there's an importance in acknowledging that. But then I think also what you're speaking to is it goes so much further than that, right? So we might start it, we're doing this to prevent harm, but really what we're doing it for is to provide support. And so, you know, and I know other organizations, for example, Fireside Project, they have a peer support hotline. They use the word risk reduction a lot. But I think even what you're saying is really moving toward what is it that we're doing. We're talking about opportunities for growth. We're talking about opportunities to support one another. We're talking about communities coming together and taking care of each other. And I think at the heart of it, that's really what I feel like Zendo's doing. You know, I don't think of it so much as, I mean, the harm reduction piece is part of it. Like we're out there trying to prevent arrests and prevent hospitalizations and things like that, like specific things. But, you know, at the end of the day, when I think about what we're doing, it's really just about caring for one another, and that feels very different than harm reduction. So I appreciate the differentiation, and and I haven't thought really specifically about how I see that carrying forward, but I do see the value of our messaging around that, and how we're speaking about what it means to, as a community, come together and care for one another.
I've heard it called benefit maximization.
Oh, yes.
We'll do 1, 2, 3.
Let's go.
Somebody will have to ask it.
I can ask Chelsea on my personal thing.
Benefits us all if you ask. Yeah.
Okay, it's actually not so much a question, and I'm forgetting it with all of this conversation. I wanted to point out that when you listed different harms that Zendo reduces, that you talked about systemic harms like incarceration or dealing with the medical industrial complex.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's one of the ways that Zendo can have a positive impact on the harm reduction model, is instead of thinking about reducing harms in somebody's individual life, thinking about the way that Zendo and the support, that kind of support that Zendo provides, reduces the harms of the world outside of the individual.
Yeah.
I also just really quickly wanted to comment on the hygiene question, and state that in my limited experience volunteering with Zendo and undergoing the training, one of the things that is really hammered during the training is constantly reflecting and asking yourself, when you have something you want to say, asking yourself, why do I want to say that? Is this really going to benefit the other person, and is it really in their best interest, or is this really coming from a egoic place or a desire to limit the suffering that they're experiencing because it's too much for me? And when you practice that, that actually is a hygiene practice, because what you're doing is you're differentiating yourself from the other person. You're figuring out what is yours and what is theirs, and limiting some of the harmful enmeshment that can happen when you're providing care to another person.
Yeah. Thanks, McKenna. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, I make a brief comment on harm reduction because I think it's relevant, and then my question. So when I joined the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna in 2017 for a consultancy, my team at the drug research section did not really know what harm reduction was. Just my supervisor from Pakistan, which is usually a rather conservative member state, he knew exactly what it was because he studied it. And by the end of my consultancy, people knew what it was, and the whole literature and the World Drug Report that they write is written in a way that acknowledges it, but until today, harm reduction is not an agreed UN term. So it hasn't been agreed in language, and the United States only like 2 or 3 years ago mentioned it for the first time. So there was a year-long fight to come up with that term, and now also in the community again we hear that it's causing harm because there is so much positive about using and so much potential in challenging moments. So people want to move away from that, and that's to be acknowledged. But then again, what has been like kind of the things that have proven to be successful? And this year, this week, working with the Zurich delegation and coming here and seeing that really one of the 4 pillars, repression, has such a higher weight here. And our 4-pillar drug policy is prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and repression in a balanced way. So in that model, it makes sense to work with that term. But other than that, in the panel where we had people who were abstinence only, it was almost like a fight against harm reduction to then explain that harm reduction involves abstinence, and many of the people have that goal. It's just not very realistic, and we need to consider the return to use as well as a possible outcome. So then, like one of the panelists suggested, to talk about love instead. And that was kind of picked up by the panel, and I think it's a beautiful way if we can move forward with love and compassion and highlight all the positive things of support. It's something that we can take away the blame that we put on either or the other side. And then my question was regarding your independence, kind of what has changed other than the insurance model. Would you recommend smaller groups that want to start something like that to immediately maybe start on their own, or rather join a bigger organization to be safe at the beginning, like from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, the benefits of being on our own, I mean, it's really just been mostly that we can really focus on what Zendo does, because it maps, you know, they have a different mission and vision, although, you know, of course, this grew out of that because it's a value of MAPS as well. But being on our own, we just can focus all of our efforts specifically toward what we're doing. And also it allows us to work with our own budget and our own administration and pieces like that that are really supportive. The second part to your question, in terms of an organization wanting to do this, I mean, I think it can be just so beautiful to have the support of an established organization. I know that can be incredibly helpful. And so I think if an organization or a new group has that opportunity, I think it's worth exploring. It's probably going to be different in every instance. But, you know, being small also has its limitations because there's only so much we can do as, you know, a small group of people, even though the need is so great. So, you know, I think it depends really on the circumstances, but I think ideally having support of other organizations is ultimately going to serve, you know, a small group's cause. Yeah.
I think we'll take 1 or 2 more questions.
Chelsea, you mentioned about this accident LIV festival and this person not surviving. So something I would like to ask you your thoughts about is the trade-off of working with volunteers versus working with employed people that do this work on a professional level.
Yeah.
And so throughout my life I had the opportunity to be part of different organizations doing this kind of work, and in one case it was an organization paid by the government to provide harm reduction services at the festival, and you were required to arrive in good shape, you know, like well rested, able to be in good shape until the end of your shift. And there were meetings after the weekend where you would discuss, you know, how the shift went, what worked, didn't work. So there was a level of accountability that sometimes is hard to implement in a festival where you work mostly with volunteers, right? So recently, this year at Burning Man, I remember my second shift as a supervisor, I started at the beginning asking, how do you feel physically? You know, like, do you feel well-resourced, or how many of you don't feel well-resourced right now at the beginning? And the majority of the people raised their hand saying, I'm not fully resourced right now.
Yeah.
And so from the perspective of running a service where you know you might have a guest that in addition to psychological distress might have a medical condition, you really need to be super aware of, you know, what's going on in the space. Otherwise, an accident can happen again if you're not paying attention, or you don't have the people awake and ready to.
Yeah.
So how do you mitigate that risk?
Yeah.
In an organization where most of the people are volunteer and you
Yeah.
can't force them to, you know,
Yeah.
you're not paying them, so
Yeah.
they're volunteers.
Yeah, I think it's a great insight to really think about it through that lens, Jonas, because, you know, at events, Burning Man in this case, you know, I think people's baseline is that they're exhausted and they're dehydrated and they're out of their comfort zone. So I think it emphasizes, you know, one, how important it is to think about self-care in those environments, not only self-care like we were discussing earlier, but just self-care as it relates to being in a new environment and having to show up and provide care potentially to other folks. I think emphasis also around, you know, we use the phrase kick it sideways. If something feels like you're not available to show up for it, how important it is to be able to recognize that and ask for help and potentially you know, give the responsibility off to somebody who is feeling resourced. You know, one thing about the Zendo, which I know you're familiar with, is that we have multiple layers of supervisory support for volunteers. So there's a coordinator overseeing the whole space, then there's a supervisor, and then there's a shift lead, and then there's all these different roles, and even those roles support one another, like a medical triage volunteer, for example, checking somebody's vitals, or a logistics person making sure the space is flowing and working. There's so many roles in that space, and so I think thankfully we have that, you know, we have this multi-layered support system that allows us to kind of hold the sitters, and then we've got the pulse team should someone really need that support. As it relates, I mean, I think part of the thing you're asking is how does that relate to liability in that space if they're volunteers versus if they were to be staff? Or is it because like at Boom they're in smaller groups? Or I just want to clarify a little bit the rest of your question.
I wonder what kind of thoughts, like, you know, you had in terms of when you train the volunteers,
Yeah.
making them aware of the responsibility of arriving in a good shape
Yeah.
for the kind of service you are
Yeah.
providing.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a matter of like, okay, you're not feeling well, you know, you took too much the night
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
But, you know, somebody might arrive there that has, you know, also a health condition and might be at risk, you know.
Yeah.
And so if you're not in good health and the majority of the people in that shift are not feeling
Feeling good.
rested,
Yeah.
what kind of service can you really provide?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be better the person to go actually to the medical, even
Yeah.
if there is a psychological thing
Got
going
it,
on?
yeah. Yeah, one thing that it makes me think about, especially because I think you were referencing Boom, is that they work in small groups and small cohorts. And so that model, we're really looking at that model right now because I think in a small group, if you have the same shift with the same people every time, then one, you're accountable to your group. And you get to know each other and get to provide a different level of support to one another as you work together and get to understand the group dynamics and the different roles. So that's something Zendo has been considering. In fact, we almost did it for Burning Man this year. We found it too difficult on that scale. But I think that's one model that can really address some of that, is the cohort model where every shift is the same people that are always working together. Yeah, and then I think really it's just emphasizing, and maybe that's something where in the training there needs to be more emphasis around, specifically in the volunteer training, you know, what it means to be at an event and what it means to be able to show up in a responsible way, and really giving people the agency to see whether that's available to them, and then also in the moment, you know, I mean, I think giving people the space to say, I mean, I think it's great that you checked in with your crew and you realize, like, wow, what do we do if some of these people aren't resourced? But it's just good feedback. I appreciate the feedback to know that, and it's a question I'll definitely think on more. Yeah. Should I take one
Anyone
more?
else? Closing thoughts, Chelsea? Anything you want to close with?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that what I'll just close by saying is that, it really truly feels like an honor to be able to take care of people when they're in these spaces. It just really feels like something so incredibly special, and so, you know, how we show up in that moment and how we do that, there's just so much magic in it. And so, yeah, I just encourage us all to really, you know, imagine how we as people would want to see ourselves showing up in those moments, and how we would want people to show up for us when we're having a difficult time, and then, you know, just circulate that among each other in our communities. And I think that can really have a profound impact on what it means to be there for one another and what it means to show up for one another. So, yeah.